Let's talk success and failure in Dungeons and Dragons. For the most part, things are pretty clear cut. You succeed, you fail, and while other systems out there for RPGs do have things like degrees of failure and success, but with a consequence and things like that, did you know that there are rules for that in the Dungeon Master's Guide? Well, turns out there are, so if you want to see what those are, stay tuned. Success or failure? Failure. What's going on, folks? Ted from Nerd Immersion here, and we are going to jump back to the Dungeon Master Guide, this time to Chapter 8, Running the Game. And there's a section here I feel like gets overlooked, as I feel like a lot of stuff does, as the more I make these videos and the more times people tell me, well, Ted, I didn't know that was a thing. So let's take a look right here. So you can see it says resolutions and consequences. So you determine whether attack, saving throws, ability checks succeed or fail. When a creature fails a saving throw, they suffer a harmful effect. When an ability check equals or succeeds the DC, it succeeds. As a DM, you have a variety of flourishes and approaches to take when adjudicating these rules to make them less than black and white. Because I've stated this before in other videos, and I've been guilty of this from time to time, as I'm sure several of you have, where you want someone to be able to succeed at something that should be relatively easy. So you set a low DC, say it's a DC 10, and they roll a 7 on the ability check. And you're like, well, I guess 7's enough. But you're like, well, I wanted them to succeed automatically. So I set the DC at 7. Maybe I shouldn't have set a DC at all because I just wanted them to succeed. But this deals with how to fix that and make it more unique and interesting. And again, like I've said, I know several other RPG systems out there have concepts like this. So, success at a cost. Failure can be tough, but the agony is compounded when a character fails by the barest margin. When a character fails by only 1 or 2, similar to the example we were just talking about, you can allow the character to succeed at the cost of a complication or hindrance. Such complications can run along any of the following lines. Character manages to get their sword past a hobgoblin's defenses, turning a near miss into a hit, but the hobgoblin twists its shield and disarms him. Character narrowly escapes the full brunt of a fireball, but they end up prone. Character fails to intimidate a kobold prisoner, but the kobold reveals its secrets anyway, while shrieking at the top of its lungs, alerting other nearby monsters. The character manages to find an arduous climb to the top of a cliff, to finish an arduous climb to the top of a cliff despite slipping, only to realize that the rope on which his companions dangle below him is close to breaking. When you introduce costs such as these, try to make them obstacles and setbacks that change the nature of the adventuring situation. In exchange for success, players must consider new ways to face the challenge. You can also use this technique when a character succeeds on a roll by hitting the DC exactly, complicating marginal success in an interesting way. And that is something that I like. I don't dislike this idea. I feel like if you have played 5e by the book and maybe haven't played other systems or haven't read this chapter specifically, your brain may be hardwired that it is black and white. You succeed, you fail, you hit, you miss. And it might take some time for you to break that mentality to go with like, okay, well, maybe you do succeed, but at a consequence, or you fail, or however it is, that kind of a thing. I also like the idea of, like usually it's meets beats, right? Like if I meet the saving throw, if I meet the DC, then I win. But I like the concept of like, you just barely did it because you met it at the number, so then therefore this thing happens. And again, like I said, this rule may not be for everyone, but it's not even really a rule. It's just something listed in here as things you can do. It's not a variant rule. It's just, options for the DM. But I like it because it could be another way, again, if you're feeling like 5e is getting a little stale for you, but you don't want to change systems, which is fine. I totally understand that. Maybe this is a way to inject some new variants into your ongoing gameplay. And then by that same token, we have degrees, I should zoom this in a little bit, degrees of failure here. Sometimes a failed ability check has a different consequence depending on the degree of failure. For example, a character who fails to disarm a trapped chest might accidentally spring the trap if the check fails by 5 or more, whereas a lesser failure means that the trap wasn't triggered but botched the disarm attempt. Consider adding similar distinctions to other checks. Perhaps a charisma persuasion check means a queen won't help, whereas a failure of 5 or more means she'll throw you in the dungeon for your impudence. See, I like this one too, because we've seen this with several monster abilities. It's not super frequent, but certain things, like I think a Medusa is one that I know of from recently. Like if you succeed or you fail on a saving throw, then like you're restrained and you start to become petrified. But like if you fail on the check by 5 or more, then you're instantly petrified, that kind of a thing. I wish there was better guidelines for that, and I do wish more monsters had this as like in their stat block, as not necessarily a standard thing, but just, no, not necessarily as a specific thing to certain creatures, but as a standard thing. You know, you fail the dragon's breath weapon by 5 or more, the fire dragon, the red dragon's fire breath, you fail this dexterity saving throw by 5 or more, you're now immolated, right? You're set on fire, and you're going to have to put yourself out the next turn, right? Or you fail against the silver dragon's breath weapon by 5 or more, your speed is halved or cut by 20 feet or whatever. That kind of a thing. I think that would, again, help to expand the content that we already have, and maybe you do just release that as, again, part of like a variant thing for DMs to use, expanded failure degrees for all the different monsters, therefore breathing, once again, new life into old content. And lastly, something that I feel like a lot of folks struggle with, depending on what games you watch online, depending on how different DMs play, but critical success or critical failure. Rolling a 20 or a 1 on an ability check doesn't mean a failure or an automatic success. If you're, say, a rogue, and you have a very high, with expertise in stealth, let's say, and you roll a 1, and it's like, well, that 1 turns into a 14, when I add my plus 13 for my, my ability score modifier and my proficiency bonus, that means you could still succeed even though you rolled a natural 1. We as players and as DMs, just RPG fans in general, we see a 20 on the die roll, we think, yes, I did it. We think a 1 on the die roll, we're like, oh my god, what's the horrible thing that's going to happen? But that in 5th edition, that's only tied to attack rolls. However, you can choose to make an exception to exceptional roll into account when adjudicating the outcome. It's up to you to determine how this manifests in game. An easy approach is to increase the impact of the success or failure. For example, rolling a 1 on a failed attempt to pick a lock might break the thieves' tools being used, and rolling a 20 on a successful intelligence investigation check might reveal an extra clue. And I kind of like this. The more, again, we've been with 5th edition for a long time now. And the more I run and the more I play things, the more I find myself striving for unique and interesting mechanics that go above and beyond the base game that I've come to love so much in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. I like that concept of, like, if you roll a natural 1 on an ability check, it's a failure, clearly, or for the most part, it will likely be a failure. But then also something bad happens. Like, that's when the lockpicks break, right? How do you determine when someone's trying to pick a lock, when do the lockpicks break? Well, the natural 1 is. I'm going to try to persuade this person to, let me into this gala. And I roll a natural 20 in my persuasion check. And they're like, oh, of course, please come in. And then they also provide you, like, by the way, please be on the lookout for such and such a person. They're, looking for fugitives or whatever. They give you some other piece of information that makes it that much more beneficial because you rolled a 20. Again, like I said, depending on the table you play at, this may already be into effect. This may cause potential issues if people you're used to playing with that and then you don't, now they join your table. Once again, a further advocacy for set down ground rules in a session 0. Go through everything. This is how I play this. And you as the players in a session 0 ask the question, how do you handle hit points? How do you handle experience points? How do you handle attunement and the number of magic items I can have? How do you handle carrying ammunition and encumbrance? All these kinds of things you need to know up front so that you can all be on the same page when you roll into the adventure together. So anyway, that's it for this video. Again, it was just one of those things. The more I read through the Dungeon Master's Guide, the more I find stuff that I'm like, man, I forgot that this was in there. Because realistically, folks, I read through the Dungeon Master Guide when it came out almost 6 years ago. I read it from cover to cover. And what do I remember? Well, the magic items are right about smack in the middle of the book. There's that cool thing where you can determine where a magic item came from by rolling on a couple tables. There's no really good wealth by level table for starting at a higher level. And there's some downtime activities, but they're kind of funky and no real good rules for buying or selling magic items. That's what sticks in my brain from the Dungeon Master's Guide. But all these other useful things about just actually playing the game kind of fell out. So it's good to refresh my memory. So I'll say that again. If you're a DM and you're thinking about running a new campaign, or your campaign's getting a little stale, or you're trying to switch stuff up, do yourself a favor. Reread the Dungeon Master Guide. You may find something of use or interest in there that'll help you change the way you play your game. Thank you to my patrons over on Patreon for continuing to support the channel and supporting me. I do greatly appreciate all of that. And thank you again if you chose to watch this far into the video. And so if you haven't subscribed, I would greatly appreciate it if you did so. I'm trying to hit 50,000 by my birthday on July 12th. And yeah, I will see you all next time.